Okay. Welcome all to the Pavilion of Turkey, to our first roundtable discussions. I would like to welcome our first Guardia group who arrived to Venice like an hour ago. They directly came from the airport to take their first shift at the Pavilion. So we will have over 50 roundtable discussions throughout the time of the biennial. And to widen the discussion that we are having at the pavilion at this forum space. And I would like to thank Kutan Ayata, who was also a professor of mine in Pratt Institute 6-7 years ago. And like to have you here as the first roundtable speaker means a lot for me.
Thanks.
So Kutan Ayata is an architect and educator based in Brooklyn, where he is the founding partner of Young and Ayata. Young and Ayata are the recipients of the 2016 Design Vanguard Award from Architectural Record. In 2014, they received Young Architects Prize from the Architectural League of New York and were the finalists for the MoMA Young Architects program at the Istanbul Modern. In 2015, their scheme for the Open International Bauhaus Museum Dessau competition received one of the two first place prizes. Their work has been published extensively and exhibited recently in New York, Los Angeles, Paris, Rotterdam, Istanbul, Milan, Chicago, Barcelona, and Princeton. Kutan has been a faculty member at University of Pennsylvania since 2013. He previously held teaching positions at Pratt Institute, Cornell University, and Columbia University. Kutan was a fellow at Princeton University, where he received his Master of Architecture degree with distinction in 2004, and his Bachelor of Fine Arts from Massachusetts College of Art in 1999. So I would like to thank all of you for being here, and I want to pass the microphone to Kutan.
Right. Thanks, Erdem. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to Kerem and all the curators. And welcome. It's hard to be in Venice for 2 hours and then be thrown into something like this, but stay with us. It should be fun. So I'm going to start right with what's in front of us. And you all were asked these 3 questions. And we were kind of given those 3 questions as well in terms of structuring this presentation and moving forward with, how we maybe interpret these 3 questions, which is really about one question altogether. Why does the Biennale exist? What does the Biennale do? For whom does the Biennale exist? Is really a question about the future of the discipline. The Biennale exists for the discipline of architecture, and the content in it is where we see that future. We all have probably different positions or opinions about whether or not it works, but perhaps that's a different debate. For me, I think kind of the important thing to kind of pull out of here is maybe the state of the discipline in terms of the questions of representation. There is no single kind of point of gravity within this discipline right now. We are pulled in by different centers. People have privileging, let's say, kind of responsible designs against the kind of environmental deterioration of our planet. People who are privileging social ambitions. People who are privileging digital fabrication, so on and so forth. There is no single kind of force of gravity around which we cultivate. This is potentially interesting if we can begin to operate forcefully within this. It's also dangerous where everything gets muddled. For me, within this, one contentional condition right now is maybe issue of representation, questions of representations that we're beginning to deal with in the discipline, kind of following the, let's say, calming down moment of the digital project. Let's go almost exactly 500 years ago. And I'm going to do this a little bit, moving back and forth between today, a little bit of future and a little bit of past. But this is taken from the Raphael's letter to Pope, and basically telling Pope what architects do. And today we don't really have this privilege. We don't have this power. We don't have this position, let's say, to situate what our means of representations or conventions are in terms of a narrow definition. The fact of the reality is we are operating through multiple mediums. We write, we talk, we meet, we teach, we make models. We make buildings through conferences like this, workshops like this. We mediate architectural thought. So we are not confined within the realm of drawings only. For about 500 years, this is what we did. These are the rules established: orthographic projection, plan, interior elevation, not section, and the elevation itself, to constitute kind of conventions of representation within architectural discipline. We are operating in a different environment right now. While all the effort was towards building the architectural object through projective representations, we are now dealing with a digital data set out of which we extract certain information to build these 2D representations. Now, nobody draws anymore. Nobody really constructs axonometrics anymore, but you see these everywhere, right? These are all, at the end, attitudes of renderings. They are rendered to look like a plan. They are rendered, constructed to look like an axon. They are rendered to operate with a certain convention that has been operating with an architectural discourse. So another one of these conventions through the digital project is the appearance of architecture as a plausible future proposal. Naturally, within the discipline, there is suspicion about how flat, how literal, how uninteresting these representations can look. These are correct suspicions. The automation of imagination, the automation of imaging, the simplicity of how we can arrive to such a visualization is something to be suspicious of. But it's something that we all do in practice in academia. It's usually seen as evidence of design, but not part of design development or conceptual depth of any one project. If you're familiar with this website from a few years ago when the Helsinki Guggenheim competition was made, this was an impossible kind of website to navigate, made of almost 2,000 images, pixelated. You could say this was kind of the moment where either you really hated the rendering or you had to do something about it. So I'm going to talk about realism. And the title of the talk is obviously Let's Get Real. And I want to start again moving back a little bit in time. There's a difference between these two images. The image on the left is it's Peter Klet's painting from 1700 from Netherlands, and the one on the right is a digital photograph. Now, one could say, well, there's really no difference within these other images. They're just compositional still lifes. The one on the right, I would argue, is kind of a representation of a technology in terms of its perfection, resolution, and purely about composition, while the one on the left, if you begin to think about, carries itself with a degree of fiction that doesn't exist in the one on the right. If you imagine how long it took to paint this thing, probably months. None of these things existed on that surface, in that space at the same time. The light was never fixed during the duration of this painting. So a lot of these things, even though their appearance is realistic, their appearance is referring to a condition that we can seem plausible, is a total abstraction. This painting I would call is a perfectly executed collage of elements that never occupied the same space, same time. This is kind of an interesting question because it opens up the possibility of moving beyond the thing that you're looking at and allowing you to speculate what comes after or what came before. You begin to speculate about the kind of information that's not visible to you, but allows you to kind of construct other potentials around what you're looking at. And at the same time, this is what the academia kind of defines as valuable work of art. Even though everything is, let's say, represented realistically, figures are recognizable, however they're flying in the air, etc. There's a kind of science fictional, well, if it's not science fictional, it's certainly fantasy that foregrounds this painting. As we kind of move towards our time, let's say first taking a small break at the 19th century with French realism, something interesting happens. The definition of aesthetics, moving away from beauty as identified in the Renaissance, where it was kind of more objectively defined and everybody worked towards that kind of definition in creative arts, began to kind of be more expressive and open-ended through Romanticism. And this opened interesting possibilities within aesthetics. New categories began to emerge. Sublime, grotesque, comical, erotic, melancholic, kitsch, and finally strange. And strange is an interesting category because it's not that it's kind of something weird, something that's unseen. It's something that begins to produce a tension between a thing, an object, and its sensuous qualities, a kind of delamination, if you will. It's kind of separation within which we could introduce some notion of fiction in the way it define the reality of the thing that we're looking at. So if we think about realism, and if you want to move away from a realism that depicts scenes like this in terms of its first literalness, the other is the kind of pre-established political ambition in terms of how reality looks like, we might begin to open up other possibilities in terms of potentials of realism. So there's historical precedence in the way I like to refer to this. Maybe it operates more through kind of things that are familiar to us, things that let us in through their familiar figures, forms, definitions, where we recognize things as plausible, as familiar. Like all of us are very comfortable to think that we can sip a cup of, a cup of tea out of this, but then it becomes a bit more questionable when it's cross-materialized with something else that begins to disturb us a little bit. It could be experimental, it could be kind of interesting, but it could be hard to dare as well. But it still recognizes as something that it can function in a way, but just the way to treat it on its surface can begin to provoke an aesthetic response that makes you act, right? Same thing kind of operates in Heidi Hattry's flowers. Heidi Hattry makes roses and then she photographs them. But when you begin to look at them closely, something is very wrong, something is very strange with these flowers. She makes them out of animal fowl, animal waste, animal hairs. And all of us like flowers, but then we really have to make a decision whether or not this image that I recognize and kind of affiliate with a certain aesthetic experience or pleasure is acceptable to us. This is kind of what I'm talking about when I say there is no predisposed political kind of condition where the thing itself begins to produce an effect and makes you push to kind of make a decision about where you stand about your own aesthetics. Similar thing in Tim Hawkinson's Bird. This is something you can come across in any natural history museum, but the moment you realize he makes them out of his own fingernails, there's something super gross about this. It's still made of calcium. It's still made of kind of dead, let's say, dead body parts. But at the same time, the form is recognizable, but there is obviously something slightly disturbing about its make. Moving into a couple of contemporary photographers, Thomas Demand makes these very large-scale photographs of models that he constructs. If you're familiar with his work, all the models are made out of paper. They carry the parts, the way the papers are established, carry a high degree of abstraction and lack of detail. But the way they are constructed and then photographed, and the model is then destroyed, it's presented as a photograph. And there's an interesting question here. This photograph is presented off the place in front of it, and it's a photograph of a model. So you might question, well, what's the reality here? Is the reality the kind of the moment of photography? Is the reality the trees themselves? Is the reality the photograph itself? One could argue all these things carry potential and parallel realities, and they become things on their own. It's fair to say Thomas Demand's photography produced real effects of a fake construct that begins to pose like a natural artifact. A different kind of problem is kind of existing in Jeff Fall's photographs. This is Barcelona Pavilion. When you first look, there is really nothing significant about this image. But if you begin to really look closely, pay close attention, you realize everything is an equal focus. The further depth, the leaves all the way in the back, the travertine floor all the way in the floor, the wall, everything in the middle carries same level of detail. Your eyes don't see like this, right? And you understand this is a composition, a collage of hundreds of thousands of pixels onto one another to create the appearance of something that you can recognize, but there is nothing real about this image. Same thing works through Gregory Crutzen's kind of highly cinematographic images. There's more acting involved, obviously, but maybe just like the still life, it allows one to begin to project narratives onto a still image. You begin to think about the aftermath or the before of what you look at an image. While the images have profound effects and highly sensual qualities, they're again absolutely fake. Their constructions are akin to cinematic constructions, lighting, narratives, etc. So the appearance of plausible reality doesn't equate to reality. So realism, in short, if you define it other ways, could be said as a representational argument between reality and its representation. And as architects, this is what we do best. We kind of speculate on how reality could look otherwise, how reality could appear in a different way. Moving into a little bit of architectural territory, and I think this is going to be the only architectural images I show today, is Philippe Dujardin's constructions, again taking on questions of typology and turning it on its head in terms of what a typology is and how otherwise can be imagined. Now, one could argue these are not built, these are images, this is real architecture. But if you imagine all of our discursive architectural consumption is happening through architectural images, these do have architectural values. Questions of symmetry, organization, style, historic reference, architectural elements, they all exist and live in these images, live in ways that we don't consider or relate to maybe plausible reality. But their appearance as real begins to provoke architectural thoughts. Philippe Scharrer is a visualizer, and he kind of creates these incredible images of buildings, calls them built out and built buildings. They're materially articulated, they're frontal, they're kind of creating these very uncanny images in the way we begin to relate to elevational condition. And they never appear kind of out of the realm of perception of how we photograph. But the reality of this technique is kind of interesting. There is no rendering engine, there is no building, there is no, let's say, building itself, right? This is all kind of textures being pushed and layered in digital environment to produce the appearance of reality. And they're uncanny and unmistaken. So the reality of what you look at could come at you through different kind of scenarios. And here, I think, kind of going back to the still lifes, abstraction and realism in some way work hand in hand together to produce this kind of appearance. So I'm gonna take you through a project, and I wanted to kind of do the second half of this through student works that I develop at UPenn. And I think it's important for you guys to kind of think about your responsibility here as students. You are gonna define the nature of what this pavilion is gonna look like and its future. And I didn't want to do it with our own work, but I wanted to do it with student work that's working through some of the things I'm discussing. Very shortly as an intro though, we worked on this project in terms of, we are an architectural practice, but we do, kind of with my partner Michael Young, we do experiments that are outside the realm of architecture that allows us to experiment in aesthetics, materiality, fabrication, that then find ways into our architectural projects. So we kind of we were interested in this question of rendering, how we materially render, how we digitally render, how do we not render like how renderings look. So we kind of designed this object. We had this drawing. We mapped this drawing onto the object to see if we could kind of begin to render a digital kind of construction that begins to produce kind of a materiality, kind of a fiction about itself. You weren't sure what you're looking at. You weren't sure whether or not this thing is made of something that you can recognize, or you would make an assumption and then that assumption would prove to be otherwise. And then take a papercless painting and replace the object with it. Begin to kind of figure out, how can you kind of render painterly? How can you operate within an image environment that doesn't project, let's say, utopic future, but allows us to step out of our present and situate ourselves in a different moment? If you think about it, architecture is always a speculation to a future reality. It is an incredibly clumsy medium to speculate on the moment, as we know how politics shift, how our conditions around our environment shift so rapidly. Our response is always behind. So in that sense, it's kind of a weird thing to always try to operate in the present. To be able to step out of our present is an interesting exercise in itself, and I think more realistic in the way we can respond back to the world. And these paintings are, just kind of going back, these paintings are kind of interesting in the way they're detailed. And how do you kind of put something in its environment? Now, you might say, what does this have anything to do with architecture? We look at it as a context, we look at it as a site, we look at the other objects within these paintings, other things that we need to kind of respond to, participate with, towards the goal of really changing the background of the reality that we're looking at. Interesting thing happens when these things jump as physical things back into the world. Through their articulations, their materiality is hindered. These are all made of powder, but there's no way to tell what they're made of. Some of them look like suede, some of them look like ceramics. There's kind of a shift in your perception, and that's the kind of fiction I was referring to in terms of kind of an object, the tension between an object and its sensual qualities. Now, once they kind of come out, there's kind of an interesting problem. How the hell did the objects jump out of a painting? That's maybe a 500-year-old problem that one needs to establish. So there's a seminar I teach at Penn Design called Parafictional Objects. Students go through the same exercise of taking an object, rendering it, learning to represent it in a way that's out of our time, but also keeping in mind some idea of a function that could be misinterpreted, misused, abused, reappropriated through its travel to today. So I'm going to move through these very, very quickly just to give you a hint. These work best when you can't really say what object has been pushed into the painting, what has been done. The best ones are always the ones that you cannot really tell it, locate it. That means the kind of act of rendering or painterly rendering is beginning to work, deal with the environmental conditions and compositional conditions that are already in there, pushing away rendering from condition of being an exotic reality of the future that's more fantastical to something more in the background. So these things, after they kind of jump out, become physical fabrications, the same kind of problems that I was talking about in terms of introducing a fiction into their materiality becomes the central focus. And regardless of what they are made of, they begin to carry a story with themselves. And the interesting thing becomes once they collectively kind of move out and begin to occupy their physical world, an interesting problem occurs, right? You need to create a narrative between the painting and the object itself. And that's when the project gets really interesting. That's when the projects get to a point where you need to create some kind of a counterfactual history of the object itself, relying on other forms of representation to document that history, document the transformation of the object. Sometimes the objects are misused, reappropriated, taken apart, transformed. They become more contemporary. In archaeology, about some of them finds older versions of the objects. How do you create the evidence for it? I tell my students, I'll believe anything you say as long as you can represent it. And that's kind of a really interesting exercise because it pushes you to step out from your own biases in relationship to present. And the kind of effort becomes very specific in terms of what is it that you need to visualize. So visualization rendering begins to acquire a very clear purpose. And depending on the representation, it becomes kind of a very different problem of how it enters our world. So we kind of situate kind of these objects among other historical artifacts. We insert them in other kinds of media. We kind of situate it again, push them in the kind of functions of everyday and how we conceive in the world. We make real artifacts, hack them into everyday conditions through which others unknowingly could participate in political acts. We kind of venture into solving, let's say, degenerative health problems through the objects that we design, then produce the kind of evidence how that could be overtaken. We designed fidgets, jewelry, represent that all together towards a heightened sense of realism, both through the images, but also fabrications that produce kind of its real effects. And things can get quite weird, things can get quite interesting, but all towards the effect of creating this fiction about this object. Not a singular fiction, but a fiction that begins to open up other readings, other possibilities. We cultivate animals, we invent their kind of consumption methods, how they're packaged, kind of create a full narrative around specific objects. As long as these are multiple in their associations, as long as they are kind of open-ended and indeterminate, we kind of move away from singular definitions of what a thing can be. And how does that relate to architecture, right? All this kind of fictional nonsense or kind of fun exercise. I sum it in these 5 points. You can replace all the objects with buildings, other things, it doesn't matter. They are at the end kind of discussion about a thing, an object, something, an entity, and its essential qualities, the tension between them. So these 5 points: realism as an aesthetic argument regarding the tension between reality and its representation. Medium promiscuity, the fact that we're operating through multiple mediums within architecture. Aesthetics are understood to be primary vehicle for conceptual and political effects. Architecture is constantly engaged in questions of context and background of reality. Architecture always manifests as a specific object or scenario that inserts itself into the constantly changing conditions of reality. So I think these 5 questions for me are kind of the most important things to look through how we answer the 3 first questions that were in the presentation and stated by the curators. This is the lens through which I look at the questions. This is the lens through which I see the discipline and our problems of representation. All right, I'll take it.
Yeah. Thanks for the inspiring presentation. I would like to open up the microphone to the crowd here. And yeah, if you guys have any like questions or like contribution in the discussion, you're very welcome.
First, thanks for presentation. I have some questions. What do you think about metamorphose or metamorphism? Yeah, and I ask that question because all that people you say think about representation styles or types. First, orthographic drawings, and then we using computers, and then maybe we use another objects next time. I don't know, and that's a big question. I think always something is changing, but how is it changing? That's important. How? Yes, always. Everything is all things change. Yeah, that we know that. But how? I don't know. And
it's a tough thing to answer. How everything changes. They change. We don't know how they change. It's a super general question. So, I mean, maybe the way to kind of jump in from directly what changes in our tools of mediation is kind of a more focused question. Like there's a part of the discipline who see the act of drawing as the locus of architectural discourse. Is drawing dead? Can we call things drawings anymore? These are questions that are being asked. I would say as our tools of mediation, as our technologies evolve, though we operate through some of these conventions that are familiar to us, or conventions that work through the discipline, are things still we engage them differently. So how these change conceptually are super interesting. How these conventions need to be reconceptualized is a super interesting question, and that's kind of where our focus is. How everything changes, though, it's too much of a general question for me to give you an answer, because I really don't know how everything changes. Yeah. I don't know if you could maybe narrow down the question, I can be more helpful. But the way maybe I'm trying to kind of get the undertone of what you're asking is the changing landscape in which we operate and how we respond to it as architects. Right? And for me, that changes directly works through mediums of representation, not only through buildings.
So we talked about reality issues, and you compared a painting to a photograph, and there's always the question of whether a photograph could be considered to be more real than a painting, because those things do they actually exist in front of the eye versus the camera? And the thing is, like, reality is always manipulated regardless, because that even if that moment like existed for a second in a photograph, or if it were just set up, it's always kind of a process of bringing thoughts into an image, right? So in terms of architecture, kind of transitioning from these hand drawings and a different method of putting your thoughts again into an image, into these more realistic, questionably, renderings that you were talking about. Do you think architecture loses something in this process, or does it, gain something to be able to visualize something way more realistically? So I guess.
I mean, that's a super precise read. Kind of the difference between the photograph and the painting. The funny thing is, we cannot really call it a photograph anymore. There is no photons being grafted on a paper through a chemical process. They're all actually rendered digital illuminations, right? So even then, we are basically talking about the conventional photography, but not really photography. But that's as a side note. I think, can we gain through photorealistic imagery? I would hope so, because it's something that we engage, all of us, all practices do, but it somehow operates at the kind of at the side track. They're not really, part of it. It's just there. It's either a marketing mechanism or evidence of what you have already done. Oh, by the way, this is how it looks. And these two artists, especially Philippe Dujardin and Philippe Scharrer, like beginning to kind of poke at it in a really interesting way. They're not designing those buildings like, let's say, how we do at our schools through computer modeling, etc. But they are producing an appearance of architecture that inherently has architectural provocation. And that, to me, is enough, because we can begin to look these representations as separate things. An elevational rendering could operate on its own terms differently than a plan. The discourse of a plan and appearance of a building vis-a-vis the elevation carry with them different histories, different ambitions, different politics. One might say the plan itself is more about how we organize a space according to certain politics. Maybe carries itself less of an aesthetic argument. The appearance of an elevation is far more about its aesthetics than maybe its political organization. This could be argued completely differently too. Who am I to say the building elevation doesn't carry any politics with itself? But I guess the point is, it's something we do every day, and it doesn't carry itself an apparent criticality and ambition. And others in other fields are actually thinking much harder about this question in terms of the appearance of reality that we should be experts of far more than we do.
Do we have another question on the table or on the forum? I think we also exceeded our time, right? Thank you for the presentation and the discussion. And we will continue with the next speaker.
Thanks for having me.